with so much gruesome, graphic violence? Why not let us imagine
Because it's so much fun, Jan. Get it?
Welcome to Random Movie Reviews. I'm Nathan, and today I'll be ranking the films of Quentin Tarantino. So this is something I've been wanting to do for a while. For those who are familiar with my channel, you've probably heard me talk about Quentin Tarantino before. He's easily one of my favorite filmmakers ever. I know, it's kind of a cliche film bro comment to say. I don't care. I just love the guy. I think he makes incredibly entertaining and unique movies that are kind of a hodgepodge of so many different genres that it ends up coming out feeling completely fresh, even though it's really just a ton of ideas kind of culminated into one. However you feel about the guy, there's no denying the impact he's made on the film industry. There's no denying how many other filmmakers he's influenced, for good or bad. He's going to go down in history as a legend. There's no doubt in my mind. He's far too important to the world of cinema, whether you love him or hate him. And I know he kind of elicits that reaction in some people. And there's really no middle ground. You either love Tarantino or you hate him. I love him, and so ranking his 9 movies was not an easy task by any means. It was very difficult to really sit down and comb through the movies and rewatch them, which, you know, I rewatched all these movies this year and a little bit of late last year too, so they're all pretty fresh in my mind. So yeah, this is not going to be an easy ranking, but I did it, and it is ranked from worst to best. And I'm not going to get super in depth with the movies. These are all going to be I'm just going to give kind of brief overviews on my thoughts and feelings on the films. But for those who are interested to hear my more in-depth thoughts, I have written letterbox reviews for all of these movies, pretty lengthy ones too, and I'll make sure to put a link to the description below for those interested in seeing those. But with all that being said, let's get started. So at number 9, we have Death Proof. This probably isn't surprising. A lot of people rank this as being one of Tarantino's worst movies. And it's not that the movies are bad. I'd go as far as to say with Tarantino, because he's such a consistent filmmaker, he hasn't made a bad movie. They're all entertaining in their own right, and they kind of rank from good to great to holy shit, this is amazing. Death Proof is kind of the only one that I would say is his closest movie that I would say is bad. It's just not very entertaining, especially when you compare it to the other double feature of Grindhouse, which back when this movie was released, it was a joint project with Robert Rodriguez, who Tarantino is really close friends with. They did From Dusk Till Dawn together. And so they wanted to do kind of a tribute or an homage to Grindhouse cinema. So they released the double feature Grindhouse, where Tarantino would show Death Proof and then Rodriguez would show Planet Terror. Out of those two movies, Planet Terror is definitely the more fun one, in my opinion. I like Planet Terror a lot, although I've only seen it once, and I watched it for the first time like last year. I've seen Death Proof a few times because it's a movie that I want to like, but at the end of the day, I just find it to be really dull, and it doesn't really get super entertaining until like the last 15 minutes or so. I love Kurt Russell in the movie. I think he's great. But yeah, as a whole, I think it's Tarantino's weakest film. It definitely contains his weakest dialogue. There are certain dialogue moments in this movie that go on for way too long, and it's just not interesting to listen to, which is so weird to say for a Tarantino movie because I love his dialogue and pretty much everything else. This is the only time where it kind of feels kind of forced and a little awkward, and it just didn't. The dialogue in this movie doesn't work for me, and outside of Kurt Russell's character, all the other characters in this movie are Tarantino's most forgettable, hands down. So I know there are some people that really champion this movie. They say it's very underrated. That's fine. I'm not one of them. So yeah, at number 9, last place, it's got to be Death Proof. So at number 8, we have the appropriately titled The Hateful Eight. The Hateful Eight is a movie where I really love like the first hour, maybe hour and a half. I love the pacing of the movie. I love that it takes place in one location. I think all of the actors are fucking phenomenal. I mean, obviously you got Tarantino regulars like Samuel Jackson, and then of course you got Tim Roth, You got Walter Goggins and Jennifer Jason Leigh, Bruce Dern. It's a stacked cast like a lot of Tarantino's movies. It's an ensemble. So much of this movie is great, but there's a turning point for me where it's like it starts to become disappointing and somewhat predictable. The whole first half of the movie, you're expecting a twist that's going to happen. Like, oh, how are our characters going to get out of this? What's going to happen? And you want to assume that it's not going to be the predictable twist that's going to happen in the movie. You want to think it's going to be something greater than that. And then when the twist or non-twist happens, when we find out what we thought was originally going to happen just happens anyway, you're like, oh, well, I thought it was going to be something a little bit more kind of surprising than that. And then it kind of turns into a kind of classic, somewhat cliched bloodfest towards the end of the movie. And it's just kind of disappointing, that last half of Hateful Eight, where it's like I wanted something kind of greater and grander. I just felt like the movie was building up to something that we were going to be like, holy shit, I didn't see that coming. And then when the movie does start to escalate, it's like it's kind of predictable. At least that's my point of view on it. Maybe you guys might feel differently, but most of Hateful Eight I really love. I love how the movie's a big part of it is kind of a callback to The Thing. In fact, Tarantino used some of Ennio Morricone's score from that movie, and he puts it in this movie. So yeah, there's a lot I really like about Hateful Eight, but I do think that it kind of loses steam in kind of the last act or so. But so yeah, that's my thoughts on the Hateful Eight. Number 8, Hateful Eight. Okay, so the one at number 7 is going to be hands down the most controversial placement of all these movies. I want to say that from here on out, I pretty much love every single Tarantino movie. So keep that in mind when I say this. But number 7 is Reservoir Dogs. I really like Reservoir Dogs a lot. I used to love it, but as I've rewatched a lot of Tarantino's other movies, it has kind of fallen down in terms of placement in comparison to his other films. Look, this is his first movie, and it's one of the most iconic and influential film debuts of all time. There's nothing that I can say or anyone else can say that can take that away. But because it's his first movie, it's also kind of his most amateurish in a way. Everything that Tarantino does great in Reservoir Dogs, whether it's from the characters, the dialogue, the soundtrack, the iconic violent scenes, I think he would do all of those things even better in his subsequent movies, with the exception of the 2 movies I mentioned prior to this. It's a great movie, and it's a great starting point for Tarantino, but he would just get better and better from kind of here on out. And it's one of those Tarantino movies where, and I don't say this a lot, but there are moments that kind of go on for a little longer than necessary, and I start to feel its runtime. And this is one of Tarantino's shorter movies, but it feels a little bit longer. And so Tarantino's sense of pacing isn't the best in Reservoir Dogs, in my opinion. But there's so much about this movie that's great. Like I mentioned with Hateful Eight, and I'm going to mention with his other movies, the entire cast is absolutely dynamite. The soundtrack is amazing. There are so many iconic scenes that stand out. The infamous stuck in the middle with you scene, which is still horrifying to watch, even though we don't see it. It's very psychological. So that scene still packs a punch, and it's a wonderfully violent and entertaining movie. But I just think his other movies after this are better. Don't kill me. I'm just saying. I like Reservoir Dogs a lot. I can't quite say I love it like I will say for the rest of these movies here on out. Okay, numbers 6 and 5 are like, this was the hardest placement for these 2 movies because I could like switch back and forth. I should also say that on my Letterboxd, all of these movies from here on out are all 5 out of 5 movies. I absolutely love all of these movies. So this is where the list gets really tricky for me and could probably change. You know, the next time you ask me to rank Tarantino again, I could see some of these movies from here on being switched around, especially these next 2. But with that being said, right now at number 6, we have Jackie Brown. Jackie Brown is often seen as being the black sheep of Tarantino's filmography. It is the movie that feels the most different from the rest of his movies. And I think there's a couple of reasons behind that. Firstly, this is the only film that Tarantino has made that was based off another source material in terms of something specific. In this case, it's Elmore Leonard's Rum Punch. Elmore Leonard, of course, is a very famous pulp crime writer, and a lot of his books have been adapted. Out of Sight, directed by Steven Soderbergh, is fantastic. That's another great movie. But yeah, so Jackie Brown stands out in that sense, where the movie is a direct adaptation, more or less, to Elmore Leonard's book. And it kind of feels the most grounded, the most mature in the sense that this movie isn't really based around super violent, intense scenes with crazy scenarios. This movie is a lot more low-key, and it's a lot more character-driven. And it's a movie that's grown on me significantly. Like, when I first saw this movie, when I was 16, I thought it was boring. I was being immature and stupid. Like, this movie's boring. Nothing happens, blah, blah, blah. 16-year-old me, it's like a lot of 16-year-old yous, we're pretty dumb. And so, watching it now as an adult, I absolutely love this movie. And I kind of love it more and more every time I watch it. I think Pam Grier's performance is absolutely phenomenal. Same with Robert Forster, who was nominated for Best Supporting Actor. His chemistry with Pam Grier is fantastic. Samuel Jackson, I think, has gone on to say that his role in Jackie Brown in particular is his favorite Tarantino role. So that's pretty cool. And then we got Robert De Niro, who's playing a character that you've never seen him play in another movie ever. It's so different from every other role he's done, but it's very unique in that regard and very interesting and captivating to watch. And then there's Bridget Fonda, and she's great in this movie as well. Just, yeah, once again, the cast is dynamite, and the pacing of the movie may be slower in comparison to most of Tarantino's movies, but when you watch it for the characters, especially for Jackie herself, who is such a relatable and lovable character, you can't help but root for her. And like her whole escape plan out of this scenario is just so awesome to watch, and the soundtrack is amazing. I could go on and on. Jackie Brown is a movie that it's definitely one that stands out in Tarantino's filmography in a way that I think is pretty wonderful. All right, here we are in the top 5, and at number 5 we have Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is one of my favorite theater-going experiences ever. I went with a big group of friends. We were all super excited because we're all big Tarantino fans. We're watching the movie, and right off the bat, the movie has a very different tone in comparison to most of Tarantino's movies. Tarantino's really great with structure, and of course he is famous for non-linear storytelling. He likes jumping around from time to time and makes his movies have a very distinct feel. But in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, there is some of that non-linear storytelling still, but like it kind of feels structureless in a way that I love. This is essentially Tarantino's hangout movie, where you're hanging out with these characters. And if I should say that some people, like, if you're not familiar with Charles Manson and Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate, if you're not familiar with any of that going into this movie, you're going to be like, okay, what is the point of this film? I think you have to be aware of that real life situation, which of course ended in horrible, just terrible tragedy. You need to have an awareness of that before you go into this movie. Luckily, I was aware of that because I went through a big true crime phase in high school, and the whole Manson case was really fascinating to me. And so watching this movie, in fact, when it was announced, I was like, oh, I wonder what Tarantino's going to do with this. But most of the movie, and of course we'll get into the ending, but most of the movies, these characters hanging out with each other, we're dealing with the actor Rick Dalton, his bodyguard and best friend Cliff Booth, and of course Sharon Tate. And we're kind of seeing their lives in the world of Los Angeles, 1969. And of course, all of this culminates into the last act of the movie, which was one of the most tense things ever for me watching it in the theater, because I'm like, oh God, what's going to happen? But I should have known. And spoiler alert, Tarantino rewrites history in a way that is shocking, violent, one of the funniest fucking things I've ever seen. I was tears. I was laughing at how insane that last act was, how surprisingly violent it is, because for most of the movie, it's really not that violent. I think there's only one really other violent scene where Cliff Booth is at the Spawn Ranch and he's beating the shit out of that hippie guy for fucking with his car, or actually his boss's car. So he makes him change the tire and he punches him and his face gets bloody. That's about only the really like overtly violent scene. And then you get to like the last act of this movie and it is maybe one of the most violent things Tarantino's ever done, but it's for a purpose. There's a very specific reason why Tarantino executes it the way he does. And the movie is like, it's surprisingly uplifting, and it just has a vibe that is just wonderful. And I've rewatched it quite a bit within the past couple of years. It's a movie that I return to often because I just love the vibe of it, and it's really different. It's really distinct. Some people don't like this movie. Some people think it's really boring. I mean, that's fine. I understand it because, like Jackie Brown, this is a movie that just stands out for completely different reasons in comparison to most of his other movies. But I absolutely love it, and it's become one of my most rewatched Tarantino movies. So that's why it's at number 5. At number 4, we have a Tarantino favorite. This is a lot of people's favorites, and it's certainly one of my favorites, and that's Django Unchained. What's there to say about Django Unchained other than it's fucking awesome? It's one of the most badass movies ever. It's one of the most satisfying revenge films of all time. It contains some of my favorite Tarantino moments ever. It contains some of my favorite Tarantino characters ever, such as Dr. King Schultz, played amazingly by Christoph Waltz, the only actor who's worked with Tarantino to win Academy Awards, so that's pretty awesome. You have Leonardo DiCaprio playing a villainous role that is not only villainous, but like one of the most despicable film roles in movie history, or at least in recent memory it is. It is amazing that DiCaprio was willing to take on such a gross character in be amazing at it. I mean, I think this is arguably Leonardo DiCaprio's greatest performance. And that scene, of course, the infamous scene where he accidentally slams his hand and breaks it on, I think it was on like a dish or something, and he cut it brutally. And he kept rolling with that. I mean, that's crazy. That's absolutely crazy. So yeah, amazing performances, an amazing story that is just so satisfying because slavery is such a horrific and disgusting topic. And one of the things about Django that I find really interesting when I rewatched it is that there are two types of violence in Django Unchained. There's the really grounded violence, almost all revolving around the topic of slavery. Whenever there's like, we see like a whipping in one scene and stuff like that. Like that's all treated very like harshly, and it's like kind of brutal to watch, and it's not fun. And then there's the other side where there's Django getting revenge, and he's shooting guys, and like this I think this might be Tarantino's bloodiest film. They're just blowing to pieces. There's a squishy, disgusting mess, and that stuff is really fun to watch. So I think it's interesting that Tarantino very wisely was like, I'm going to treat the subject of slavery with respect, which he does. And he got a lot of flack for even talking about slavery at all. I think he does it with a lot of respect. And he wanted to take that subject and turn it into a revenge movie because why not? And it's just amazing how he's able to balance those two tones and do it so perfectly. And Jamie Foxx is so fucking awesome in this movie. Same with Kerry Washington. So yeah. The Django Unchained, not only one of Tarantino's best movies, but definitely one of the best Western movies, especially modern Western movies, because we don't really get a lot of those anymore. And Django Unchained certainly ranks as probably being the best if we're talking modern Western films. It's just so great. All right, the top 3. When I was ranking this list, the top 3 were pretty definitive because these are the 3 Tarantino movies that I revisit the most. So at number 3, we have together both Kill Bill Volume 1 and 2. I just have to say, it drives me crazy when people try to separate these movies. Like, Tarantino always said that it's one film. Because if it wasn't, then he'd be done making movies. He said he'd stop at making 10 movies. And so if you separate Volume 1 and Volume 2 of Kill Bill, that's 10 movies. So it's one movie. And they are both amazing. It also annoys me when people are like, oh, Volume 1 is so much better than Volume 2. I'm like, they're both amazing for completely different reasons. Kill Bill Volume 1 is the action portion. It is the story of Beatrix Kiddo getting revenge on the assassins that did her wrong, that were associated with Bill. And it is awesome. It's violent. It's some of Tarantino's most stylized filmmaking ever. I mean, he has a whole anime portion in this film that is amazing. Maybe contains my favorite soundtrack of all of Tarantino's films, which is, you know, his soundtracks are always amazing. So that's really hard to rank, but there's so many, like the theme, kind of the whistle theme in this movie is so beautiful. I absolutely love it. So Volume 1 is all the action stuff. It's badass. And then Volume 2 is like, that's the heart of the entire story. So I don't understand. People are like, oh, Volume 2 is not that great. It's like, guys, you got to stop watching movies just for the action. Like, yes, the action is great and fun and we love it, but if the action has no meaning and it revolves around characters that we don't care about, it's not going to hit as hard. So Volume 2 is just as great as Volume 1, and it contains probably my favorite scene of both segments together, and that is kind of the confrontation between Beatrix Kiddo and Bill. And Tarantino kind of subverts your expectations, and instead of doing like an epic showdown, it's like a very intimate and long scene of them basically talking about where things went wrong for both characters and their relationship, and it is riveting. It's almost like an action scene, but with words. Some of Tarantino's best dialogue is in that scene between Beatrix Kiddo and Bill. And the way the movie is just a beautiful tribute and homage to the kung fu action movies that Tarantino grew up with, specifically the Shaw Brothers movies. And we get cameos from iconic actors of that period, with Gordon Liu, of course, and Sonny Chiba. And yeah, it is just a love letter to those movies. And I love kung fu movies. And so obviously, Kill Bill is one that's going to rank highly with me because I just love that genre of filmmaking so much, and Tarantino does an amazing job. I mean, I think his best action, maybe outside of Django, that he's done is in this movie. So yeah, Kill Bill, it's a goddamn masterpiece. 5 out of 5. Volume 1 and 2, they're both amazing. It's number 3, Kill Bill. Okay, so I need to specify before I mention these next two movies. I need to clarify some things. With certain filmmakers, I have to make a distinction between what my favorite film of theirs is and what I think is their best film. So at number 2, we have my favorite Tarantino movie, and that is Pulp Fiction. Pulp Fiction is often ranked as being Tarantino's best movie by most people, and I think that's because for a lot of people it was their first Tarantino movie. It was my first Tarantino movie. I first saw Pulp Fiction when I was 16, which I think is kind of like the perfect age to watch Pulp Fiction, and it blew my mind. I have always loved movies. Since I was a little kid, I've always loved movies, but the turning point for when I loved movies in a more casual sense into when I became outright obsessed and wanting to know everything about the art of filmmaking was when I was 16, and during a weekend that I had to myself, I watched both Kill Bill and The Godfather for the first time. Both completely different movies, but those are the two movies that I credit for sparking my passion for filmmaking. And Pulp Fiction is just one of those movies where if you're not really familiar with a lot of the genres that Tarantino's kind of pulling from and he's kind of throwing into this blender and making his own distinct concoction of filmmaking, it's one of those things where you're not familiar with that and you watch it, you're like, I've never seen a movie like this. It is one of the craziest, most original movies ever. And then when you start getting into those type of genres that Tarantino's pulling from and you go back to Pulp Fiction, you're still amazed by, like, that's amazing how he's able to pull from all these different types of filmmaking and make his own kind of, you know, flavor. It's just so unique, and there's no wonder why Pulp Fiction in particular went on to create such a movement in the independent era of 90s filmmaking. That's the 90s, as Tarantino said, was kind of the 70s part 2, where film companies were letting independent filmmakers make the movies that they wanted to make, and they ended up making a lot of money. Pulp Fiction was a very profitable movie because it was such a small budget to make, and I think it ended up grossing over something like $200 million, which in 1994 money is pretty crazy, especially for an independent film. And it's just everything about Pulp Fiction, in my opinion, is absolutely perfect. I know it's been it's become kind of trendy to say that this movie's overrated, to which I say, bullshit. No, the movie's not overrated to me at all. I think there's a very specific reason why Pulp Fiction is often ranked as being one of the most important and influential movies of its time, and it's because it's fucking Pulp Fiction, okay? It is one of the best, most entertaining movies ever. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. From the performances to the soundtrack to so many amazing scenes and surprising moments. And it's one of those movies where it's like, I wish I could watch for the first time again. Because I've seen this movie, I can't even tell you how many times I've watched Pulp Fiction. But I watch it all the time and I never get sick of it. But that first time you watch it, it's like, it is truly like holy shit, where's this movie where's it going? Like it keeps you on the edge of your seat the whole time. It's funny, it's violent, it's action packed, it's surprisingly romantic. It's like, it gives you everything. So yeah, it's fucking Pulp Fiction, dude. Number 2, Pulp Fiction, but it is my favorite Tarantino film. And I'll get into why once I talk about my number 1 pick. Okay, so when I take a step back from my obsession with Pulp Fiction, and I look at Tarantino's films objectively, there's one film that really stands out as being like, wow, he is at the height of his powers here, from the way he's directing this movie, to the way he writes it, to the scenes, to just all the technical aspects. There's one movie that I'm like, I think it's his masterpiece. The number 1, Inglourious Basterds. Inglourious Basterds is a movie that leaves me in awe every time I revisit it. The opening scene alone, which Tarantino is on record for saying is the best thing he's ever written, and I concur, that I was blown away when I found out that scene goes on for nearly 30 minutes. That's crazy that scene goes on for that long, because it does not feel like it. It is one of the most tense scenes I've ever seen in a movie, and regardless of how many times I've seen it, it still leaves me on the edge of my seat. And then from there, the movie only gets better with this amazing story about these soldiers who are looking to just kill as many Nazis as possible, collect their scalps. You got to get them Nazi scalps. And then we have a dual narrative where there's that side of it, and then there's the other side of the girl at the beginning of the movie, Shoshana Dreyfus, in her revenge plot against Christoph Waltz's character. And it is just, the ending to this movie is one of the most satisfying endings of all time. The storytelling is amazing. The way that Tarantino balances like the fun kind of pulpy grindhouse film elements with the more sincere and heartbreaking elements. Like, I think Shoshana Dreyfus, that character is one of Tarantino's most underrated characters. She's one of the most heartbreaking, sympathetic characters ever, and the way her character arc ends in Inglourious Basterds is both tragic and cathartic in almost equal measure. It is a movie that I think is maybe Tarantino's best looking film, the way he utilizes sets and the way he films scenes. And maybe my favorite Quentin Tarantino scene ever, I think my favorite Quentin Tarantino scene ever is the scene in the bar with Michael Fassbender. And that whole scene is amazing, and it's some of Tarantino's best use of tension and suspense is in Inglourious Basterds. I know I'm kind of a rambling mess here because there's so many different thoughts. Like I said, if you want to hear my more in-depth and specific opinions on these movies, I'll put my Letterboxd list down below where you can read the reviews. But yeah, Inglourious Basterds, I think it's his masterpiece, quite frankly. So yeah, guys, that's my list of Tarantino films. What are your thoughts on Tarantino? Do you love him? Do you hate him? Put your rankings down below. I would love to see your guys' rankings. Do you agree with my list? Do you disagree? You know, obviously, I support good, healthy debates, but all I say is don't be a dick. So yeah, as always, thank you guys for watching.